Hi, this is Kevin Gibbons.
This is Steele Wagstaff.
We are Design Lab TAs, and today we're going to go over our workshop, I Like Pretty Graphs.
Yeah.
Best practices for data visualization assignments.
Great. First thing we wanted to just let you know is that what Design Lab is. You're able to read this slide, explain some of the kind of features and goals of Design Lab. You can also learn more about Design Lab by visiting our website, which is designlab.wisc.edu. Users, students, and teachers who'd like to visit and make use of our services, we encourage them to make an appointment, which you can do at the website by clicking on that button and making an appointment to visit us.
So, what are our big questions that we're going to try to answer in this presentation? Where can my students and I get data? Which graphics are best for our data? What software should we use? What should I include in assignments? And how do I evaluate data visualizations? So today we're going to try to answer some of those questions, and at the very least try to give some tips that will help you answer those questions.
In order to do that, we're going to take you through kind of 4 big points in this presentation. You can see those here next. We're going to talk briefly about data visualization and infographics. We'll talk about some principles of graphic design, principles for good infographic assignments that you can use for your undergraduate classes, and then we'll talk about some workflow and software solutions.
So let's start with the big question that's a bit hard to answer is what is data visualization? And my favorite definition that I've seen throughout the webs is from visual.ly or visually, both representation of data and the study of presentation of data in a visual way. And I think those two aspects of the definition of data visualization are important to consider. In general, it's more than analysis, and it's more than illustration. It's both. It's combined analysis and illustration. It can either complement a text or be self-contained. Some are just supposed to be informational, and you draw your own conclusions. Others the author or producer of the graphic will come to conclusions that she wants readers to notice. Some examples are hand-waving. That's visualizing data in some way. Basic charts and graphs. Even if you make it on Excel or whatever sort of simple program, it's still data visualization. As it gets a bit more complicated towards maps, infographics, and what we see a lot of today are interactive data visualizations.
And you can't see it right now, but we're waving our hands at you, listener. The next slide.
Okay, what is good data visualization? Well, it's a good question. I'm glad you asked.
Oh, yeah.
I would say that I like the way that David McCandless presents it as good data visualization complements information and design in compelling and interesting ways. So the information needs to be both interesting and have integrity, and the design needs to have kind of form and function built into it. And I really love this infographic about infographics at the informationisbeautiful.net site. And in that way, you can sort of see how David McCandless has broken down what makes those things interesting. You know, we've all seen really beautiful infographics or designs, but you don't trust the data or you don't trust where the person's coming from. And the same with, oh, they've got great information, but it's just so hard to read that I can't follow it. And I think this infographic helps you kind of tease out why information and design are both important to understanding effective data visualization.
Yeah, the next slide we're going to look at is kind of a definition of what infographics are. I think you're able to read the 3 points here, and we'll take you through some examples which help you get an idea visually of what infographics are and can look like. The next slide is the first example we wanted to show you. This is a long-form visualization. I think that was published by a media group called Flowtown, and it looks at like Twitter use, who's using Twitter, and some demographic statistics about Twitter use here.
Yeah, I like this one. It's a very common trope for using infographics, where you have 2 columns down the middle, very sort of large form infographics, so you can see what they're doing. They use just very basic iconography. You've got sort of the man and woman that we often see outside of bathrooms. They've coordinated colors pretty well. It's all sort of very visual appealing, and if you look closer at it, you can sort of understand a bit about how they're describing Twitter users itself. So just some visual, you notice that they don't really cite a lot of their data. It's a bit simplistic what they're trying to do, but at the same time, very sort of compelling and a very classic example of what infographics are these days. This is from the New York Times website that was put out. I think it was also published in the paper after the tsunami and earthquake. And so it's just trying to understand the scale of that damage by combining maps with radiation and sort of teasing out all those figures. And this is a great example of an infographic, you know, from some of the masters of infographics at the New York Times, putting together what is a very sort of complicated, difficult to understand topic and trying to put it in a way that is compelling visually and informationally.
Presentation there, yeah. This next slide's another similar one. Kai Kraus produced this one, and this is to help us to visualize the true size of Africa. So you can see both a geographic representation here, combined with data tables, combined with figures, combined with maps and text.
Yeah, what I like about this one is, you know, it's provocative right off the bat because you can make out the outline of the other countries. It sort of puts in stark relief, like, we don't have a good conception of how large the continent of Africa is, but it's also got a lot of deeper information that you have to sort of look in and read further to understand some of the rich information that he's provided inside this infographic.
Here are a couple more whimsical ones. The one on the left is kind of a cartoony, long-form history of golf, and it just produces a timeline that follows a visual track from 1452 and goes on for quite a ways further up to the present. Visualization on the right was published in the Sports Illustrated magazine, I think around 50 years ago, and it looks at the batting chart for Ted Williams, a great hitter. The heat range is corresponded to his batting average for balls pitched in those various areas of the strike zone. So you can see both by color and a numerical value in the center how that information is being communicated. And you can see visually where Ted Williams' strengths and weaknesses are as a batter. This last visualization that we're going to show comes from David McCandless. We mentioned him earlier. He has a book called Information is Beautiful. And here's a really interesting visualization in which he tries to represent the various information around popular dietary supplements. How much media attention they get will determine the size of the bubble, and then where they're placed from top to bottom corresponds to the amount of scientific evidence supporting their positive health effects. So you can see a couple of different things are being visualized and represented here on this kind of large-scale graph.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of an infographic that does something that would be hard to impossible to do in text form, that sort of out all this information that we get about health supplements and sort of put it in a way that's, okay, you know, that's sort of basically using as its measure of how much scientific data do we have to prove some of these things. It's very compelling.
If you're interested to learn more about data visualization or follow some blogs that regularly post good updates, we've included, I think, 4 examples here that have regular updates, really beautiful examples of different kinds of infographics and data visualization projects that you can kind of steal from.
Yeah, the best way to get better at these and to encourage it in your students is just to visit and look at more things and figure out what you find attractive. Another question that we're not going to spend a lot of time answering, but where can you find good data sources? In a lot of your classes or the work that you do, you know, you'll have some places where they go to find them, but if you're interested in sort of publicly available data that is easily accessible and relatively clean, these are some of my favorite sources of places where you can just find data right away and you could plug them in and try to answer some compelling questions. Google Public Data Explorer makes information readily available. You can even do some of the analysis there if you don't want to use any other software. And the same is true for a lot of these other ones. The census, I think you can just download them, but they also have graphs and charts available.
So the next slide, we want to talk about several reasons why people might use data visualization assignments. We'll let you read them for yourself, but we feel really confident that there are several strong reasons why you'd want to use these, and that they help you to achieve the kind of teaching and pedagogical objectives that you'll have in your classroom. We found these things to be true in our classes that we've both been students in and taught, and we expect that you'll find them as well.
So, and one of the hardest questions to answer is, what do I do with my data? Should I use a bar graph? Should I use a pie chart? Should I use a crazy network analysis? It's hard to know. It's sort of on a case-by-case basis what types of graphs are best for your data. But things to consider, that I consider and that other people do when they're trying to figure out what type of chart to use are, what kind of relationship are you exploring? Try to write it out. Specifically, I want to understand, for example, I want to understand, what is the relationship between poverty and food insecurity, or, between population levels of salamanders and the brackishness of the water, and so basically try to figure out exactly what you're trying to explore. How many variables are there that you want? Because some are most appropriate for smaller number of variables. Some can incorporate many variables. What can you simplify? The best data have been sort of gone through and made available of what is the most important about these data, and then just compare what you have to other similar data visualizations. Look for people who are using data very similar to your own. When you go into teaching it, biggest bit of advice we would give is that you are teaching design, and that is something you should definitely get used to. We're going to go over the basic principles of design, and we hope that by going through this and just by practicing it in your classes that you'll get that teachers of data visualization will get used to the fact that design is such an important part of what they're doing.
Just to give you a map of where we're going next, we're going to talk about some basics of graphic design. We'll talk about some of the goals for effective visual design, then we'll talk about some building blocks for how to make a well-designed project, then some principles for effective design, and then we'll talk more about how to manipulate visual elements in the actual practice of building them. Here are the 4 basic goals for effective visual design. 3 C's and an E. Capture viewers' attention, control eye movement, convey important information, and evoke the intended emotion or response. Or action, I suppose, in many cases. Those are your kind of basic goals when you're producing your design, and you should have those in mind as you're trying to communicate them with viewers. There are 3 basic building blocks of every infographic, every visual design. The first are the visual elements. These can be photographs, they can be images, anything that attracts the eye and it provides a kind of visual contrast. The main purpose of these is to help you to create a focal point, a place where you want the viewer's eye to linger, to be centered on your overall design. The second building block would be typography. By this we mean like text. Not only just the text that you include, but how it looks, the choice of font or typeface. Our advice are to avoid defaults. We've all seen plenty of things in Arial or Times New Roman or other kind of basic fonts, but also to keep it simple, and we'll talk more about that later. The third basic building block is space. By this we mean stuff that isn't filled with either visual elements or type on your design. The basic idea in this is to use negative space as your friend, not to be afraid of white space, particularly around the edges of design. We'll show you a couple of examples to see what we mean. Here's a really nice infographic made by Michael Palkner representing the ancient Hebrew conception of the universe. First thing you'll notice are these visual elements, things like the sun, the earth, the clouds. He's built in these visual elements that help us orient our mind and think about how they might have visually conceived of the universe. Second thing, typography. You'll notice that all of the text on this display is in the same font or typeface. It's in all caps, and he includes dark font on light backgrounds and light font on dark backgrounds for visibility. The third thing you'll notice on the right here, how much negative space he's included. There's lots of breathing space around the outside, which means that if you're looking at overall composition, looking at it on the right, it's much more pleasing to the eye than the one we've included, that close-up on the left. Use negative space, particularly around the outside of your design, to help your design breathe. The next thing we want to talk about would be some principles of effective visual design. We suggest that in designing you use grids. This is a basic feature of most kind of layout softwares. You'll be able to visually place a grid over your workspace, which helps you to orient objects to each other and get them arranged in the way that you want. It's really helpful also to have margins set up so that you know how much white space you want around the edges or space that makes it safe for printing. And to use something that's known as the rule of thirds in design. And this essentially, using the rule of thirds means that you would divide the kind of workspace that you have into a grid that's 3 equal parts by width and 3 equal parts by height. Once you draw that grid that divides that space, you then want to place key visual elements or typographic elements at a place where those grid lines intersect, and we'll show you an example in just a second. The second principle is to use negative space. Instead of using boxes or borders or walls to kind of separate everything in your design, let space separate things. Let them be spatially and visually separated from each other. The other piece of advice is not to trap or surround negative space in the center of your design, but to push it whenever possible to the outside of the layout. It's best that negative space isn't trapped or clogged in the middle of the design. Here's an example that kind of exemplifies both principles here. This is one of the visual infographics we saw earlier. When you place a grid over the top of it, you can see how this particular designer has really carefully used grid layout. The bottom third of the image is essentially entirely negative space. The middle third has a focal point right in the exact center of the image. That's where the colors begin to radiate out of the center, her head scarf. They come out of the center of the image. And then you'll notice the top third, that's where all the text has been placed in those grids. So very carefully use this principles of grid and of negative space to produce a pretty visually compelling infographic here. The next thing we want to talk about would be some other principles here. We recommend that you do the following things. You can read them here. Hopefully they make sense from the text included. And we'll show a couple of examples in a second that help exemplify these principles. More principles. We suggest that you work with people's natural reading habits, which means have your design flow from top to bottom and then from left to right. Use the size and weight of graphics and font to indicate importance. Bigger things should be of bigger importance. And use colors and bolding strategically and not haphazardly in your project. The other suggestion, we said earlier we talk about typefaces. We suggest that you really work to limit the number of competing elements in a design. That means don't go overboard with selecting 5 or 6 really fun fonts. Pick 2 or sometimes 3 typefaces for the entire design. If you want to produce variety, derive variety within these typefaces by using that same typeface in italics or in bold or in small caps. That helps to make a cleaner, better looking design generally. So your fonts are less likely, typefaces less likely to clash. We're going to show you an example that helps exemplify some of the principles we just covered. Here's a recent web page designed by Google to highlight their data centers. You'll notice here these arrows are guiding your eye, and there's text boxes there that explain what we want you to look at. We can see principles of a grid layout clearly put in place here. And you also can see how they've used opaque text boxes to make sure that the text is legible by putting light text on a dark backgrounds.
I want to talk a bit about some of the visual characteristics that you can manipulate and kind of elements that you can manipulate, which are very relevant to building your own infographics. I'll use the language of contrast, the difference between light and dark, value, which is basically, value is the color itself, so whether you have red, green, blue, etc. The size of your variable can change as well, as can the position over time, the position throughout the space that you're working in, and 2 other principles that visual characteristics I think are really important are establishing a hierarchy of which information is most important and calling that out and which information falls within the same line, and a sort of consistency of design. I'll be using these sort of 6 terms in different ways, and when I talk about those visual characteristics with students or with other people working in this medium, that those are some of the most important terms that we sort of bat around. So here are 2 look at these 2 examples. In factory production, which of these would you choose for your proper color scheme? The one on the left or the one on the right?
I picked the one on the right, Kevin.
Okay, you'd be right.
Oh, thanks.
Because
tell me why.
The one on the left is a sequential color scheme.
What does that mean?
Meaning that, it goes from light to dark. And so you would think that, logically, that all those things would be of the same type, whereas the one on the right are more discrete, so you have that, green does not match up with magenta, and so basically cars and steel bars are not sort of equivalent categories. So using that sequential color scheme on the left is not appropriate. Okay, between the two of city population, which one would you choose, Steele?
I'd clearly choose the one on the bottom left. I think if we're talking about size, to let the visual information represent the differences in size instead of a shape difference.
Right, we're talking about a changing number. You win! We're talking about a changing number, so the smaller, below 10,000 should be smaller rather than some other shape with different angles. And this is just, a couple of sort of simple examples of how you choose your visual variables and what are the right ways. Does the visual variable change with the sort of message that you're trying to get across? Here's some other ways that they can change. Is it size? Is it the type of shape, to sort of discriminate between the variables, like we said, colors and values. Direction is another important one that comes up and is actually a sort of hard one to manipulate well. And then you've got pattern, and especially in black and white illustrations, pattern can be very important.
So something that came to my mind just recently based on this is thinking about whether you're designing something that's going to be printed or for the web. So these colors on the middle left are great for contrast if you're doing a web design only. But if you're going to make something that was going to be printed by their users on a black and white printer, those colors might not produce the same distinction. So something that we see in the bottom right or just above it in the middle might be a better way of representing difference, knowing that your users would be likely to print it on black and white printers.
Yeah, that's a good point. So selectivity. On the left, which ones sort of call out to you more?
Wow, I think the stars really leap out to me.
Yeah, the stars, because of the negative space, because their shape is so much different than the other variables there, then somehow the stars become very important because you're more easily able to select them out. How about on the right? Which ones sort of stand out to you?
For me, the blue. I don't know what it is, but the blue gets me.
Yeah.
How about you?
I mean, either the red or the blue. I think it depends. Some people have said green when I've showed them this. But in some ways as well, yeah, the blue stands out because maybe there seem to be more of them. They're sort of like more continuous.
And they're in the center.
But it's not quite as easy to figure out which is the important information as it is on the left. So that may or may not be important depending on what you're trying to do. And here are some other ways that people sort of manipulate variables. Notice a sequential color scheme, so it's within the same variable and it changes over time. Should you do the one on the top left, which as it gets darker, the number gets higher? So
when you say sequential, like the way I'm understanding this is that it's going from lighter to darker in intensity as the variable is increasing?
So meaning that they're the same sort of logical type, but as it gets darker, you get sort of an increase in number, but there's still this sort of same...
the family of colors.
Yeah, same family of colors. And so you have the one on the top that just changes in shade over those numbers. Then you have the one just under that on the left where the size of it changes as well, so it's a little easier to see how many fall within those categories. And they're basically doing the same thing on the one on the right, but I would argue that one's a little harder to read than the one on the left. Just some examples. Here's visualization we wanted to go over. This is another McCandless informationisbeautiful.net illustration, and this one I think uses visual convention very well and packs a lot of information into an infographic. They use the visual convention of red and blue, liberal and conservative. But he is a British guy, so I don't know if he did this on purpose. My guess is that he understands well how U.S. maps are made, but in this one, red is liberal and right is conservative.
One of the things I like about this is how well it demonstrates both principles of symmetry. This is a very symmetrical graph, which helps orient you and learn how to read it. And I think the other thing it does is, we were talking about clumping or clustering earlier. This is a graph that clumps and clusters its information under kind of categories or headings or types. And that's the way it organizes those things into each of these separate headings. And you can identify that you've got into a new cluster whenever you see that kind of banner with a title in it. So that's teaching you its own kind of logic of reading there. It uses lots of arrows to direct the eye and produce flow as well through the document. And it's using a lot of the kind of tricks and tools that we were talking about earlier to help guide you as a reader.
Yeah, and just the other thing I'd add is its use of symmetry, both visual symmetry but also informational symmetry. He has built a case for how each group of people sort of look at families, look at adults, look at beliefs, and so you can directly compare those within this sort of political dichotomy. So it's a striking way to sort of present this information and try to see, how people from these political persuasions see the world.
Yeah. We have a couple pieces of advice when it comes to choosing colors. The big piece of advice is to make harmonious choices when you're choosing colors and typefaces. Colors mean things to people. They have cultural and emotional significance, and you should be aware of what colors are likely to mean for your intended audience when you're choosing them. The other thing we'd really stress is thinking about different abilities to perceive color. Before you finalize a design that uses color in important ways, check to see how it would look or appear for people who suffer from different kinds of color blindness. We've included a website here that allows you to do that with an image or a web page that you want to check out to see how it will look. The other thing to think about is, we mentioned briefly earlier, whether you're designing for print or for the web. When you're making a project and you're doing it for the web only, it's great to use what's called an RGB color profile, which stands for red, green, and blue. Though if you're designing for print, the suggested color profile is a CMYK, because those corresponds to the 4 inks that are most commonly found in your printer. That's something you can get in under the hood when you're working in a design program, but it's something you should be thinking about, particularly if you want your colors to appear the way you design them on your screen. Here's a McCandless example that kind of visualizes what we're talking about, how colors have different significances and meanings in different cultures. You can explore this and see kind of what he's choosing to visualize by looking more carefully at that graph. 2 tools that will help you in coordinating and choosing colors. There's lots of websites like this out there, but there are sites that help you to bring a color palette or profile together, see what kind of color design professionals have thought pair well and naturally. Both Adobe Color on the left and a website called Color Scheme Designer, which lets you match and pair different color schemes and see how they look together.
And I use, especially when making infographics, Color Brewer quite a bit, because you're able to choose either a sequential or other types of color schemes. You can check whether how people with color blindness would see them, and it's sort of very appropriate for sort of data-driven choosing of color. But to add on to all these three, when choosing a color, there's no formula, there's no perfect way to do it. Just look, if you see a data visualization or just an illustration whose colors you like, look at that color, bring it into an image editing program and just figure out which colors they're using and use them. Nobody has copyright over colors.
Right.
And so here's an example of a poster. We're talking about information layout. We're just going to quickly go over these. Notice music is very big. It uses your eye flow that we're talking about very well. You flow into music, you obviously see that at first, you see the heart, but then also, because of contrast, you see don't miss a beat, which in this poster is their ask. They don't want you to miss a beat, they want you to go to this, to Maricopa Community College. And you can sort of study all of these different things. So it's a very sort of clear way to sort of lay out the information and draw you in.
Yeah, I'd say in this poster, just to add to what Kevin's saying, that we can see so many of the principles we talked about, where the typography became the principal element of visual design, and its size, its weight, and its color all contributed to it grabbing your eye. That's what makes music compelling. Its color, its size, and its location on the page. So I think a great design there.
This is one of my favorite maps because it puts a pretty mundane question, right? What do we call soda or pop or Coke within the United States? And then through that sort of, in this map, through these sort of visual representation of the data, you understand a little bit about migration, the connections among peoples, and the way that ideas spread throughout the country. And they've also got sort of multiple color representations based on sort of the majority of the people who are there. So you have this sequential color scheme, but you've also got these sort of discrete types, so a typology built up. And you see these patterns emerge based on how they've sort of split up these variables. Just to point out a couple things, notice around sort of St. Louis there in Missouri that you've got You know, you've got basically a bunch of Northeasterners who have probably who migrated there at one period in time. You also see in Alaska, you've got you know, everybody's saying pop just like they do in the Midwest, and that probably has a lot to do with Midwestern migration throughout the West and into Alaska.
Yeah.
And personally, I just, you know, and also you see the Northeasterners around Miami, but the rest of Florida is sort of more like the South and calling all soda Coke.
I really like this graph. The one thing that I might suggest, I like how the colors are linked into families. And the one thing that seems like a strange choice, this is maybe quibbling, but if you look under Other, there's a box that's marked No Data, and they chose to make it dark purple.
Yeah.
I don't know why that choice was made. To me, it looks too close to the Coke family colors.
Mm-hmm.
And I would think if it was no data, leaving it blank or empty or white might be a better visual choice, where the color matches the function in the graph.
Yeah, or maybe gray, you know,
Yeah.
so then it wouldn't interrupt the patterns too much, but still be separate, but
Oh well.
whatever. And here's a map. This is a map of, you know.
Tell me, I have no idea, because it's
Yeah,
clearly not labeled.
right.
or
I mean, well,
marked.
that's you know, I pulled it off of a
Oh, okay.
website, but this is a map of the progression of killer bees throughout the Southwest.
I have
And
no idea
some
how to
people
read
call
it.
them Africanized bees, right? And so if you look at it, it's, you know, you should be able to look at this and not have to sort of look to the legend to figure out what the heck is going on, because basically you see that when you go from 90 to 95, you're sort of changing pattern, you're changing the shade of color. When you immediately look at it, it doesn't look like a progression of
No.
the increased sort of dominance of these populations within these states. You know, it should, I mean, I look at this map and I just feel so sorry for the people who made it, because it could look like this crazy zombie apocalypse that is coming to kill your children. It's not, but you know, through basically they could have made a stronger argument with their visuals if they would have just had a sequential color scheme that went from, you know, light to dark or the other way around, that sort of helped you sort of see the flow over time to show that variable well.
Absolutely. We mentioned typefaces earlier. Here's a couple of tools that will help you select typefaces. The site on the left is a website that will allow you to see any phrase or text displayed on every font that's currently installed on your computer. So if in the top center you type in the text you want and it will show it to you, you can scroll down and see how it looks in those various typefaces. And then the website on the right is this really fantastic game that was designed by a designer that helps you understand how to match and pair typefaces and gives you several suggestions for very elegant, beautiful looking typeface pairings for your designs.
Yeah, so not only can you get those pairings, but also if you sort of read the text that goes through in this sort of dating game, you can have a better understanding of what kerning means, why one typeface matches with another, and it helps, you know, sort of orient you. And this, I've learned so much from this site to what principles are important for when you choose a typeface and why some work and some don't. We also wanted to make available, when you're looking for typefaces, don't just look on what the default is on your computer. Here are a bunch of really, you know, free typefaces. They've got all kinds of great examples. They organize them in all of these great ways. Steele's favorite is DaFont. Font Squirrels is widely used. All of these are sort of great places to sort of look for some free typefaces.
You can get sucked in. Be careful.
Yeah, it's a rabbit hole. Enjoy it. Yeah, so just we're getting towards assignments as we're sort of getting closer towards the end of the presentation. For effective assignment design in infographics is similar to other designs. You want to begin with learning objectives, make those clear. You want to have sort of specs for the final project. Do you want it to be a website? Do you want it to be posted on a blog? Do you want it to be standalone? Do you want it to be a report that's printed out and passed out to other students? You know, be sort of clear about the specs for what you want. And then within that final project and within your goals, track back. Break the project into a series of tasks and assignments so that students aren't just flooded, you know, wait till the end to sort of do what they need to do. Which is, you know, the way we should structure all of our work, of having these tasks that we can check off the list as we move towards our final goal.
It's especially true, I think, of digital media projects, because they can seem daunting and complex to students. So having a set of milestones gives you a feeling of accomplishment and helps you know that you're working on pace.
And with those milestones, you've got like places that the student can check in to the class or to the professor, or to the design lab.
Definitely.
Along with that, how do you support this awesome assignment that you've put in place? Develop a vocabulary. We're going to go over these in a little bit. Develop a vocabulary. Establish a workflow that is clear to you and clear to the students of what they should be doing. Send your students to Design Lab. We're here. We're available for them, especially if you can either make it required or you can just send students in if they're struggling to pull their question together or to tweak their final project. It looks like it's finished, it has that sort of finished quality to it.
Once again, they can make appointments at our website?
We'll get to that in the end.
Okay.
But make sure to build into it. There's just critique all the time. They sort of are bouncing ideas off of students. If they're in groups, they're bouncing it off of the groups, that you have a chance to sort of look at drafts. You know, this process of critique is so important because it's design, that there's no other way to do design than to sort of see if what you're doing is working for people and communicating what you want it to. Developing vocabulary. Hopefully we've done this in this session when we talk about contrast and color and the hierarchy and the position and white space. But make sure that you define these ahead of time and maybe put it in a syllabus or a project assignment. Which elements are important to you? What are you looking for? Mention them in class. Use them to critique other work. When I critique a map that we've seen in here, we've gone through infographics. We've tried to call out what works about its visual layout. And then use conventions from authors you like. You know, find a book that you really like and pull from it and cite it and tell students, okay, well, we're going to use this person's way of organizing this information. These are a couple of books we would recommend. White Space is one. We used some of the vocabulary for this session. White Space is Not Your Enemy, and it is a great way to start with. For hard sciences and biophysical sciences, Visual Strategies is a visual design book specifically written for scientists. So is written for people who haven't had a graphic design class, but take producing charts and graphs and scientific illustrations seriously. Visual Miscellaneum is another one just to have around for a great list of examples, and this is David McCallum's, whose work we've shown and cited quite a bit in this presentation. And it's nice just to have those kinds of things available so that you and your students can learn from these examples and call them out and use vocabulary around them.
Definitely.
So I'll just quickly go through workflow. A lot of people have questions about, how should I lay this out? What should they do? And the workflow in this is much the same way of how you would write a paper or how you would make an argument. You choose a question, you gather data, organize it, you see steps 1 through 4, and then you're sort of moving toward choosing a type of chart or graph, and you've got aesthetic decisions. You produce your graphic, and you're sort of laying it out in public, plugging it in, and then you're drafting and critiquing, going back and forth and tweaking things. And I would divide these sort of steps into 2 important bits of the way an infographic assignment comes together, which is to sort of lay out the information, figure out what you're getting at, and then go through sort of the more design elements. And this is a message that we're saying over and over again. There's a reason for it. We've got to combine this information and the design together. And these aren't discrete steps. You're going to go back and forth and jump from 7 to 4 and back again. But make sure you're laying out to your students and to yourself as you're doing it yourself which parts are sort of gathering information, putting it together, analyzing that relationship, and then how do you communicate that through design. So what software should I use? Well, I would sort of divide up the process of making an infographic into 3 discrete steps. You have your data analysis, which you use to create a chart and a graph that you then use to sort of plug into a final document. And a document could be a website, a digital document. Most common programs to use for data analysis are R, which is probably the most common for statisticians and a lot of people who use very large data sets. Stata and SAS are very common with social scientists and other biophysical scientists. And Excel is used by a lot of people, and Excel is very powerful, especially for smaller data sets and for some sort of more basic analyses, and is much more graphical than the other 3 and sort of easier to learn. So then you've got this data, you've analyzed it, and now you want to make into a chart and a graph. And all four of those initial ones can do that. You can spit out bar graphs and pie charts and analyses from ARS data in SAS and Excel, and they're very powerful. But then I'd also sort of tack onto that Adobe Illustrator, that you can pull either. You can't pull all your data and analyze it within Adobe Illustrator, but if you have your output variables, you can make a very small spreadsheet, put that into a sort of a chart and graph creator within Adobe Illustrator. And Adobe Illustrator is not very difficult to learn, and within Adobe Illustrator, you're allowed to manipulate the individual elements a lot easier than you can in those other four programs. The other option is to export from those programs into an editable format that you could then work in within Illustrator. You'll hit some pitfalls with that. In R, it can export as R, and those other ones you can export as a PNG or another type of file in which each individual element is editable. And so then you can pull that into Adobe Illustrator, but sometimes it's a bit finicky. But all of those options work pretty well. And so now you want to make it into a final document. And Excel, you can do it from start to finish and come up with a nice report in Excel. It's a little clunky, it's a little difficult to do. Really high quality for New York Times or heavy print publications, Adobe Illustrator and Adobe InDesign are really sort of the standard for doing that. Adobe Illustrator for single-page documents or for digital documents that you would publish online, like those long-form infographics. A lot of those, if they're done within a sort of software, is usually done in Illustrator. Adobe InDesign is perfect for long reports and sort of things that are heavier in text, because it's a very powerful way of sort of moving text into columns and wrapping it around certain illustrations. You can do some of the same things in Word, but I want to pull my hair out when I try to pull in a lot of images and work with larger documents in Word. It's not that difficult to learn Adobe InDesign, and it just makes it a lot easier than working in Word, in which you'll lose your document or get lost in the margins. And
Now, we've mentioned in this the kind of industry leaders. These are the most commonly used software for all of these, and I'm aware that they're not universally used, and in each of these cases you can also find they cost money. You can buy software cheaply through the university, but if you'd like to use open source options, they have open source databases, they have open source desktop publishing software, and they also have open source word processors, which will do many of the same things, if that's an option that you're considering financially.
That's a great point that that we've put in the most common ones, but OpenOffice or LibreOffice are, some would say, just as powerful, if not more powerful, than the Office suite, and there are lots of other ones that are open source solutions. There are also some online solutions that I want to at least mention, and some of them are even more powerful than the other ones, or at least help sort of quickly produce what you want to. Google Public Data Explorer, you can produce really compelling charts and graphs from that. Same with Many Eyes, and they'll have Many Eyes and Tableau will have sort of data sets available that you can use, or you can upload your own data and then analyze it in there. I'll note, though, that one of the problems is that in Many Eyes and Tableau, if you upload your data, then it's publicly available. So that may or may not be okay, depending on what you're working on. StatSilk or StatPlanet is great for maps, which Tableau does okay, but Many Eyes and Google Public Data Explorer don't do quite as well, just as we're recording right now. And then Gapminder, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, is a great way, especially for sort of international public health and development data, is very useful. And then Visually and Creately also have really strong platforms, and they've got a lot of icons available to make some of, which are very important for some of those longer form infographics. All of those you can do sort of from start to finish. They might not make it very easy to analyze the data, which you should maybe start with one of those analysis programs that we talked about. But these are great online solutions. Some basic tips for exporting. Work with your native formats, which is AI, Adobe Illustrator, PSD, and Photoshop. INDD and InDesign and PowerPoint files for as long as you can. Don't export or save as a different file until you feel like you're done editing and moving things around. Use vector or lossless raster formats. A vector is a vector format for a picture. Basically takes a picture as sort of a series of lines or polygons or shapes or rectangles and talking about how you would fill them, as opposed to a raster format, which is sort of like also called a bitmap, which is basically a big square and figuring out what each point, each pixel within that square, what color it will be.
And this is kind of a technical point, but as Kevin's saying, when you're using what are called lossy raster formats, each time you're saving, it's converting the image through a kind of compression algorithm that will cause you to lose quality with each individual save, which is why we recommend using native formats and kind of lossless formats as long as possible, so you lose less kind of quality through the kind of compression and saving stages.
If all that sounded like gobbledygook, basically the main takeaway is, don't export into a PNG or a JPEG until the final format and you're ready to sort of put it up or print it out.
Right, and keep your originals.
And always think of pixels per inch. The standard, if you're not printing something very high quality print, is just 300 pixels per inch for print and 72 pixels per inch for screens.
Yeah.
That depends if you're sort of zooming in and out or how you're using the data, but that's sort of the commonly accepted use for that.
You can get by with lower print resolutions, and that's kind of close to the high end. But yeah, those are the general.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and always export at the size you need or larger.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, it's sort of very basic, but if it's larger, that's okay. But try to figure out, hey, I want my graphic to be 500 pixels wide so I can put it into my website. Well, export it as that, and it'll be a lot easier to plug it in.
Right.
And I just wanted to put up this image to show a little bit about the difference between vector and bitmaps.
Yeah, nerd alert.
Nerd alert. One of the most important. This is from the Wikipedia page, actually.
So less nerdy, I guess.
But basically,
or more, I don't know.
Okay, stop. But basically, a vector you'll see is better for text, whereas a bitmap. That's why you see some JPEGs when you can't read the text, especially as it gets smaller, because it's sort of pixelated the text in a way that's very difficult to read. And so we talked a little bit about workflow, and hopefully that was a bit clearer, just to talk about our workflow or how we conceive about those things. We think of it as sort of scoping the project, figuring out what you're going to do, what the final format is, trying to understand those things.
Then designing experience.
Right. Basically, thinking of audience, what you want that experience to be for the audience. Then going to shaping the content to sort of achieve those goals. And then you make them, and then you're making the media and going back and forth and moving within that, and this is of course a circle, because of course we have to make it a circle, but we would just want to say that Design Lab can be there for any of those stages of the project, of helping to conceptualize things, of figuring out how you're going to put the content together, where you can gather some source information. And then, maybe you have some technical questions, but more sort of content and aesthetic questions, how you can do those things. And as we're rounding out, we just want to make sure when we say critique, that there's some tips to critiquing productively. Personally, whenever I do a critique with somebody, I think of it as conceptually, aesthetically, and then technically. Start with the concepts. Is this infographic doing what I want it to do? What are its goals, and does it do them? Aesthetically, but only after talking about the content, whether it does it well, then you can talk about, well, does it use colors right? Does it use those contrast, value, size, positioning, whatever your vocabulary that you're using? Does it do it well? And does it achieve its objectives sort of visually? And then talk about the technical. Well, you should put in something like this. You should make it into 3D. You should move those things around.
So starting big picture and then moving. Picture.
Starting big picture. What is it trying to do, and does it do it? And then something about the design, and then talk about the technical a bit. Sometimes it's easier to jump in and say, I hate your color scheme, but don't do that, I tell students, when I'm doing it with students, just start with the concept. Okay, you guys gotta talk about the concepts first, because that's of course what we're always trying to get across the entire time. And so we're done. Did we achieve our big questions? No, but we tried. But we think we went over where you can get data, some ideas of which graphics are best for your data, what kind of software you can use, what you should include in your assignments, and how do you evaluate data visualizations. And included with that were some basic graphic design principles. And so that's our presentation. We want to leave you with campus resources. Make sure you know about STS. If you're if you're teaching a software that you know or don't know very well, STS will either offers classes that students can take, or they'll come into your class and give an overview of a software. If you want your students to use Tableau, or you want your students to learn Adobe Illustrator so they can make something that doesn't look like every Excel graph you've ever seen, STS will send a very nerdy, geeky, erudite person in that software to present your class. Lynda.com is something everybody should know about on the UW campus. We are so lucky to have access to all the trainings on lynda.com. Just visit that link and see what they have there. It's amazing. I mean, I've learned so much about coding in PHP, or editing video, or using just any software. Most softwares out there, they'll have available training for there, and so you can tell your students, hey, you need to do this week, and they're just amazing trainers, and that's what they do. And then your students may need equipment, and they can check out that equipment at the info labs, and there's a link to sort of find whatever they need: laptops, audiovisual equipment, things like that.
I want to go through a couple final reminders here for you. You can see them. They're going to be displayed on the screen here for you. Let's just put them all up. We believe in you. We believe you can read these. We appreciate you taking the time to listen to our presentation. The final one's the one I really want to stress, and that's that at the Design Lab, we're really excited to be working with you and your undergraduates at making fun, compelling, intelligent digital media projects. At any stage of the process, we showed that kind of circle of Design Lab's process. We are able and interested in getting involved and helping consult with your students about how they want to conceive of the project, how they want to shape it, how they want to make it, and all of those elements. We look forward to seeing more of your students. We hope that you send them to their website and to the physical space that we have in College Library. And we're excited to see what you and they come up with and create.
Thanks a lot.